first15worship.org. From there's a link where you can submit your songs. There's also a few briefs. One of our goals is to give people the daily devotional resources. And if you're looking to have a catalyst for your own songwriting, you can both submit songs that you've written and use these briefs to sit down and have a songwriting session with yourself or maybe with some friends and create a song that you want to submit as well. And we're taking all submissions and reviewing all the submissions and looking for the songs that we feel like God is drawing us to the most, and then putting those in a pipeline to get those out to these millions of people that are consuming First 15.
That is amazing. Let me just, before I let you go, talk about First 15. I would assume most of our listeners know about it, but nevertheless, this is an opportunity each day to have the benefit of some of the devotional material. You also have an opportunity for people to have First 15 on your phone. And I'm well aware of the fact that people are going to be much more likely to, especially the younger you are, to actually benefit from some of these devotional works because it would be on their phone and very convenient. So talk about how people can take advantage of this and put it on their phones and begin to go through a worship time every single day with you there on First 15.
Yeah, thanks, Kerby. And one of our goals is to help remove as many barriers as possible between God's people and his presence. And so one of the ways we do that is by having this daily devotional accessible on platforms that people already use. So we have a free mobile app that you can download and get the daily devotional resources that way. And we have an amazing community inside of the app, people praying for one another every single day, thousands of groups inside of the app or small groups that are doing it together. We have a podcast. If you're a podcast listener, we have a lot of people that consume the devotional that way. We have the website with all the devotional resources and the email subscription as well. And so wherever your platform of choice is, you can find us on that platform and ideally be able to first thing in the morning, be able to have a meaningful connection with God through these daily devotional guides.
Let me also mention, of course, with the podcast, if you wanted to get the one that Craig Denison's done just recently, Be Who You Are, you can get it through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and a number of others. So you can click on these buttons to say podcast, worship, video, blog. There are just all sorts of opportunities. You can click on the button that says Go Deeper. That will take you into much more, and there's just an incredible amount of content. And if nothing else, Craig, it's just to testify to the work that you've done over the years as you are, in a sense, over all of the various aspects of Denison Ministries. And, of course, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, we're going to have your father on Friday because we're going to talk about one of the things he's talked about in his daily article dealing with Christian nationalism. So we'll be covering that as well. Mm-hmm. But if people want to connect up with you, the first step is to go to first15.org. That's the words first and the number 15.org. And, of course, if you're traveling right now and don't have a chance to write that down, all you really need to do is simply go to our website, pointofview.net, and it will take you to all of the various areas. And, of course, one is a link to first15worship.org, so we have that link there as well. Become a featured First 15 worship artist, so you have all the material you need right on our website, but I would encourage you to go there as well. Craig, as always, appreciate the incredible work that you've done, and thank you for joining us here on Point of View, and tell your dad I'm looking forward to chatting with him on Thursday.
Thanks, Kerby. Appreciate it.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to get into a couple other issues. One of those is just a real short comment. I remember yesterday when I talked about the so-called snowplow test. I thought I'd mention it one more time because Jonathan Turley, who is hardly a fan of Donald Trump and actually a person who would call himself left of center, he was very disturbed about some of the things this particular columnist wrote as well. So I thought I'd chat about that for a second, get into a couple of other issues in the news that you need to know about. Dennis Prager's written about some of the things happening right now in the pandemic and the vaccines. And then we'll get into a couple of other articles I've posted on Black Lives and many other issues. So all that coming up right after this.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Just before I get into some other issues in the news, yesterday I did talk about this columnist by the name of Virginia who was facing a dilemma because she is, by description, a Harvard-educated, very liberal journalist, and she lives in Brooklyn Heights, and she wasn't sure what to do because her neighbors, who she called Trumpites, plowed her driveway without being asked and did a good job, but she was just like, well, what should I do about this? And she said, it's kind of weird because, back in the city, meaning New York City, people don't sweep others' walkways. And she's kind of wondering what to do and all that. And Rod Dreyer, in the piece that I read from you, said, your neighbors probably have no idea of who Ben Sass is, because she was thinking maybe they'd heard Ben Sass talk about plowing your neighbor's or cleaning your neighbor's walk or something like that. They probably have no idea who he is, and they probably aren't trying to reconcile with you. They're just being nice neighbors, and it was just a very interesting piece. But I thought it was interesting that this particular column has some legs. All sorts of people are talking about it. I saw Ben Shapiro doing a piece, but the one that really struck me was Jonathan Turley. Now, you've heard me quote from him before. He is an individual by his own definition, kind of a liberal progressive law professor at George Washington University. I appreciate his honesty in the fact that sometimes he takes on his fellow liberals, and he takes her on pretty good, because as his argument in his website, this woman Virginia basically is comparing Trump supporters to Nazis and Hezbollah. I left this out when I talked about it yesterday, and I've got a commentary coming out next week on it, because, it was maybe what I thought was a bit of a cheap shot, but she's struggling with the fact that, well, these are almost deplorables, right? These are Trumpites. I mean, I can't believe they did something nice. And so then she goes in this little, if you will, side discussion about the fact that, well, even Hezbollah actually provides food and resources for their fellow Muslims, and Louis Farrakhan has provided that for people associated with him, and the Nazis even did that. Well, anyway, I just left that alone. But Jonathan Turley, I think, was just horrified by the fact that a liberal would talk like that. And he said, quote, well, most of us would think a thank you would be natural and immediate. Virginia explores her struggle in the decision how to respond by saying, of course, on some level, I realize I owe them thanks. And man, it really looks like the guy backdragged the driveway like a pro. But how much thanks? These neighbors are staunch partisans. Jonathan Turley goes on to say that under the guise of working through these issues, the column seems more like a vehicle for suggesting that Trump voters are little better than terrorists and murderers. He even goes on to say it's a kind of matter-of-factly treats such references as obvious comparisons. There is less evidence of honest internal debate, as much as satisfaction being able to demean and marginalize almost half of the electorate. What he talks about, 7 million voters. So it was interesting. I think this column is going to have some legs, because a lot of people seem to want to be talking about that. And it even was mentioned by Jonathan Turley. You're in trouble when your fellow liberals are saying, oh my gosh, this is way beyond the pale. But, just a few minutes ago, I was talking about the pandemic and the lockdowns and churches. And so just before we take a break, I thought I'd read briefly from Dennis Prager's recent column, in which it has this arresting title, How Many Americans Has the American Medical Establishment Killed? Okay, it's pretty strong. Dennis Prager has, of course, been on the program with us, been in studio with us as well, and he said, first of all, let me state at the outset that were it not for doctors, I would either be paralyzed or dead. I owe my mobility, and probably my life to wonderful physicians. So he acknowledges that medicine is a good thing. However, I must also state with equal certitude that the American medical profession as a whole and many individual doctors are responsible for, and this is strong, deaths of tens of thousands of Americans, very possibly more than that. Now, he goes, I'll skip a paragraph, into saying what I'm specifically talking about is hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. These drugs, along with zinc, which are safe as any medicines humanity has taken in the last half century, should be almost universally used to treat COVID-19 patients as soon as those patients show symptoms or are treated positive, and even as a prophylactic to prevent or minimize the effects of the illness in the first place. If they had been, it is likely that tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of those who died of the virus would have lived. If you think that's too strong, travel with me to India right now, because I've been able to see these packets that India is sending around to individuals in that country. And the packets have such things as hydroxychloroquine, zinc, and ivermectin in little bubble wraps. So that's what India is doing right now. But of course, you would be thinking that this would be a poison you're putting in your body. Now, Dennis Prager goes on to say, for the record, I put my medicines where my mouth is. I've been taking hydroxychloroquine and zinc, as well as vitamin D and selenium on a regular basis for half a year, and ivermectin for the past 3 months. More for the record, during this time, I've hugged thousands, or I guess he says hundreds of strangers at various events around the country, maskless. In addition, at home, I live with 4 people, my wife, my 2 stepsons, and fiance of one of my sons, which then he points out that couple, both in their mid-20s, developed symptoms and tested positive for COVID-19 a month ago. They were the only 2 members of the family not to be on hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin. And while they were ill, my wife and I practiced no social distancing, wore no masks in the house, and tested negative twice. As responsible citizens, we quarantined at home for 14 days. He says, my son and my fiance immediately began a course of treatment of hydroxychloroquine, zinc, ivermectin, vitamin D, selenium. And with half a day, we're feeling better. A few days later, all their symptoms had vanished. And he says, of course, the medical establishment, the media, and others committed to irrationality, fear, and making fortunes from pharmaceutical companies and keeping Americans from a normal life will dismiss all of this as just anecdotes. But I would ask, how many anecdotes about the effectiveness of this particular drugs does it take to persuade people? I would ask a more damning question, given how safe hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin are, what could we have possibly lost by allowing millions of people to take these medicines? Or to put it another way, he says, if doctors who advocate for the use of these safe drugs are wrong, what price would we have paid? He says essentially none. And then he goes through the list of people, what they've said, the comments, and all that. And so then he, a little bit later in the paper, talks about the fact that he feels that there has been a great deal of dishonesty. He says, for example, in November of last year, the NIH report titled Hydroxychloroquine Does Not Benefit Adults Hospitalized with COVID-19. He says this was dishonest for 2 reasons. First, zinc wasn't used. While hydroxychloroquine alone can help fight COVID-19, every physician who prescribes hydroxychloroquine to COVID-19 patients insisted it must be accompanied by zinc. Hydroxychloroquine without zinc is like a gun without a bullet. 2, everyone who advocates the use of hydroxychloroquine and zinc to fight COVID-19 insists it must be given as early as possible, that is, before hospitalization. So, Dennis Prager concludes the NIH test was useless. Why those who conducted it did not give patients zinc and waited until they were hospitalized are such obvious questions that either those doctors were ignorant of the protocols or else set up the test to fail. Either explanation constitutes a moral and medical scandal. Then he goes on to say, and he skips some paragraphs again because I'm trying to get to some other points, ivermectin. And again, he points out that there was a study that was announced, and that was back in August, by the way, studying ivermectin. By November 28th, the NIH published this finding. Countries with routine mass drug administration of prophylactic chemotherapy, including ivermectin, have significantly lower incidence of COVID-19. But when it came around last month in January, the NIH withdrew its opposition to it, but it also refused to endorse it, the point he's making here. And so in some respects, he then reminds us of how the press has prevented any of this information from getting out. In his third to the last paragraph, he points out that YouTube has actually taken down a U.S. Senate hearing featuring doctors and epidemiologists who spoke in favor of ivermectin. I've been thinking about doing a commentary on that because you have a sitting senator who says, since when we have testimony in front of the United States Senate, do you unilaterally pull it down when these individuals are qualified and giving expert testimony? But they did. So anyway, he ends with this. When we get to the other side of this crisis and all the danger is tallied, he says the unnecessary death and ruined lives, the medical establishment, the media, and many politicians are going to have a lot to answer for. At a great price, we have learned that follow the science and follow the scientist are not the same thing. In some cases, he says, we followed the latter off of a cliff. Anyway, Dennis Prager has some strong words to make about some of these treatments, which in other countries seem to be almost standard, but almost seem to be banned here in the United States. Let's take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention my Viewpoints commentary today is what I call Biden regulations. This is one of the executive orders written by President Joe Biden, and it is one that is of great concern to people that have been up until now thrilled about the deregulation of some of the unnecessary government regulations that have been removed under the Trump administration. And I recognize we do need government regulation, but sometimes sometimes they can be burdensome and unnecessary. Well, this executive order signed by President Biden is one that is thrilling a lot of the progressives, and I give you a quote from one of those individuals in the commentary, and very concerning to many of the conservatives, and I give you a quote from that as well, because it kind of changes the whole evaluation of a regulation in terms of cost and benefit. So you can read that in its entirety, and it's the Viewpoints commentary today. And with that as background, tomorrow I'm going to have Warren Farrell on for just a little while, and we're going to talk about the gender policy under the Biden administration. Farrell's kind of interesting because he's been on the board of the National Organization of Women, but nevertheless, you can see that even some of the feminists are starting to say this whole transgender gender policy thing is of real concern. So I wanted to give you a chance to hear from him about the concerns that many people have. In the next hour, we will have for a while Carol Swain, and oftentimes we've had her on to talk about the history of, for example, Black History Month, and certainly this would be a great time to talk with her about that. But we are going to be talking with her about the immigration policy because she's kind of an expert there as well. So we will certainly benefit from her. And if you are not familiar with Carol, she's been on a number of the Dinesh D'Souza programs talking about the impact of Jim Crow, some of the really outstanding African-American women in journalism and things of that nature. Anyway, I think you will enjoy that conversation. But again, we want to not only look back, but mostly look forward. What about these new policies in terms of immigration and the unwillingness to deport individuals that are sex offenders, that are convicted rapists, and all sorts of other things? Also, just releasing people into the general population right now without even giving them a COVID-19 test. I thought we were trying to deal with this pandemic, and so there's just a lot of issues, and we will certainly do our best to cover some of that tomorrow with Carol. Just before we take a break, though, let's also mention the last two articles I've posted for you on the website. This one comes from the New York Post. Ray Aurora, these Black lives didn't seem to matter in 2020. He points out, of course, we were all horrified and in shock about the death of George Floyd, but what transpired after that is really sad, to put it mildly, because he says if we truly believe that Black lives matter, we cannot and must not focus only on a small percentage of those lives taken, less than 0.5%, during conflicts with the police. We certainly should not be adopting policies that could lead to even more deaths in the African American community. This is perhaps the most striking statement. Last year, we saw the largest year-to-year increase in homicides ever recorded in U.S. history. Let me say that again. Last year, we saw the largest year-to-year increase in homicides ever recorded in this country. And the homicide rate in 34 cities was 30% higher than it was in 2020. And victims of these homicides are disproportionately African American. 8,600 Black lives were lost to homicide last year. Violent crime is concentrated, sadly, in primarily low-income, marginalized Black communities where the police are under-resourced and Democratic leadership many times has failed them. Let's take a couple of examples. In Chicago, 80% of the gun violence victims in 2020 were Black. And in New York City, 71% of the shooting victims were Black, even though Black population in New York City is about 26% of the population. And so the sad reality is one Black life killed less than every hour in America last year. It's just striking. And he says again, since more than 90% of Black homicide victims are killed by Black offenders, this idea of the ghost of endemic white supremacy cannot be invoked to push racial grievance narratives. As a result, the media, unfortunately, doesn't fit the narrative, turns a blind eye, and Black lives only seem to matter when he says racism is involved. And yet, interestingly enough, he points out that the probability of an African American being killed by a civilian is more than 30 times higher than being killed by a member of law enforcement. If you look at in Chicago's marginalized neighborhoods, and I've been there before, more than 3 times as many black children died of homicide than the total number of unarmed black Americans killed by police in 2020. And then he points out one other key issue, and that is our society is systematically failing citizens because the BLM movement, the Black Lives Matters movement, to be different than the idea of Black Lives Matter, has pushed to defund the police and reduce their presence across the nation. These efforts I've actually drove a lot of police officers and others to significantly reduce traffic stops, arrests, and others in the wake of the death of George Floyd. And that is a study that came out this last year. And despite the narrative here, this anti-police narrative, poll after poll, he says, shows that most black Americans don't support the movement's radical ideas. Last summer, in a much popularized and publicized Gallup poll, found that 81% of African Americans favored the same or higher levels of police presence in their neighborhoods. Even a poll in Minneapolis after the death of George Floyd showed that reducing the city's police force was more unpopular among the black residents than it was under the white residents. So this is a piece just chock full of facts, figures, and material. It's 4 pages. I've only quoted just sections of it, and you might want to read it in its entirety. And as you do so, let me also point you to the last article I've posted. This is by John McWhorter. He writes for, in this particular case, The Atlantic. This showed up in actually Persuasion. Has a new book out called The Elect, Neo-Racists Posing as Anti-Racists and Their Threat to a Progressive America. Now, I've read him on many occasions. He wouldn't agree with a lot of things we say around this particular table, but he, as a progressive, is warning his fellow progressives that this new kind of wave of anti-racism, which he calls the elect, is something that is really dangerous, and it's something that really needs to be addressed, because he points out that the first wave of anti-racism would, of course, be slavery and the whole issue of segregation. The second wave would be in the 1970s and 80s, dealing with racist attitudes. But this third wave is really an attempt to try to focus all sorts of time and attention on white fragility, white supremacy, and a variety of other things. He, in the second page there, spends some time talking about all the, if you will, logical inconsistencies of it. And he even helps you understand why he refers to it as, if you will, the idea of the elect, because he didn't want to just call it, if nothing else, social justice warriors or the woke mob or the inquisitors. So he adopted this idea of the elect, but this elect is just sort of, if nothing else, coming down from on high to tell us all that we have the wrong attitudes. And you got a problem with some of the woke theology, if you will, and some of the woke philosophy when a progressive writer like John McWhorter is warning his fellow progressives about the danger of what's coming down the pike. So again, I put that up there for you to read from somebody who has a book that probably will be a bestseller and we'll be talking about here again. That's all we have. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Hope you'll enjoy the conversation tomorrow as we get into some issues like immigration. We'll be right back tomorrow. See you then.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. it can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.